Eleanor Hayes had stood in that lobby for 3 minutes before she finally spoke. She told Adrian Brooks her father wanted to meet him. Not as a maintenance man. Not as the one who had quietly saved her project and never once asked for credit. As the man she trusted most. Adrian looked at her for a long time. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. Then, very quietly, he said he had already met Walter Hayes. And that day had cost him everything he had ever loved. He looked at her. He said nothing more. Can love survive when the woman he loves turns out to be the daughter of the man who took everything from him? The lobby of Harrington Tower was nearly empty now, the last of the evening staff gone. The chandeliers dimmed to their overnight setting. Eleanor's reflection caught faint, and still in the polished floor. She had not moved since the service corridor door closed behind him. She had not expected that. She had prepared for a dozen versions of this conversation. The polite deflection, the flicker of interest he would try to hide, the careful negotiation of two people who had been circling something real for weeks and had finally decided to stop pretending. She had not prepared for a man who looked at her with complete steadiness and told her that the first time he had met her father, it had broken his life. There was no anger in his voice. That was the part she could not stop turning over in the minutes she stood alone in that lobby. No rehearsed grievance. No bid for sympathy. Just the flat, load-bearing weight of a fact he had been carrying for a long time, finally set down in the one room where it could not be ignored. Eleanor had not known. That certainty sat in her chest with a specific, uncomfortable weight, the weight of realizing that an entire history had existed beneath what she thought she knew, and that it had been there all along. She stayed until her legs remembered how to move. Then she walked out through the glass doors into the cold air, and the question Adrian had left her with pressed against the inside of her ribs the whole drive home. When had he met her father? What had Walter Hayes done? Why had Adrian never said a word? And what, exactly, had she been walking them both toward without knowing any of it? The apartment on Calder Street was 740 square feet, and Adrian had made it work the way he made most things work, through precision and the complete refusal to treat any problem as larger than it was. Sophie had started kindergarten the fall after he moved in. He had packed her backpack the night before and sat at the kitchen table at 11 in the evening checking it twice. His mornings ran on a schedule tight enough that he sometimes thought of it as engineering. Up at 5:45. Sophie's lunch packed never peanut butter, always something with protein she would actually eat. By 7:15 he had walked her to the corner of Dunmore Avenue and watched her disappear into the flow of other small people in backpacks. He did his job the way he had always done everything, completely, without shortcuts, with the particular attentiveness of someone who understood that in buildings, as in life, the failures that mattered most were the ones you almost missed. After hours, when Sophie was asleep, he worked at a small desk doing structural calculations for a residential firm that contracted him by the project. The work kept his mind honest, and added enough to his income that Sophie's school clothes were not a calculation. He did not date. It was not a rule so much as a condition he had arrived at. After Megan, after everything that followed, the emotional architecture required to let someone in was something he could not sustain while also being the only person Sophie depended on. He had put that part of himself in a room and not opened the door. In his wallet he kept a photograph taken outside Mercy General on a Saturday morning in October, 10 years ago. Megan was laughing at something off camera. He was looking at her. On the back, in his own handwriting, was a date. He did not take it out often. He had never thrown it away. Eleanor Hayes had understood from the time she was 12 years old that being Walter Hayes's daughter was not a simple thing. It carried weight that operated like a fine fabric, beautiful at a distance, abrading at contact. She had learned to carry it well. She had taken the directorship of Hayes Urban Group's new commercial development branch 2 years ago, after finishing a graduate degree in urban planning and spending 3 years at an independent firm, a deliberate choice her father had accepted, but not endorsed. He had wanted her inside from the start. She had wanted to know who she was without the family name visible from every angle. She was not naive about men. She had been engaged briefly to someone her father had approved of with unusual enthusiasm, which should have told her something. The engagement had ended when she found a text on his phone at a party, not a shocking text, just a confirming one. She had returned the ring in a box without annotation and moved on. The Midtown Meridian project had been 6 months into its approval process when she found Adrian's note slipped under her office door. It was 11 lines long, written in a clear, compact hand. It described the variance in the load distribution. identified the connection point, cited the relevant building code section, and concluded, "I am flagging this in writing because verbal concerns in construction environments are frequently forgotten. Please route to your structural team at your earliest opportunity." It had no name on it. She had found out from the building manager who had slipped it under the door. She had routed it to her structural team, who confirmed the issue within 48 hours and avoided what would have been a significant public failure. She went to thank him in person the following Tuesday. He said, pleasantly, that he was glad it had been useful. The thing that had stayed with her was not that he had saved her project. It was that he had done it, and then walked away. No follow-up, no positioning, no use of it. In the world Eleanor moved through, that kind of disinterest in leverage was so rare it read almost like a foreign language. That was the beginning of her paying attention. 10 years ago, Adrian Brooks had been a different kind of man, only in circumstances, not in character. He had been 24 years old, 18 months into a position as a junior structural engineer at Hayes Urban Group, and already known internally as someone who asked inconvenient questions about load tolerances and material substitutions. He was happy. He and Megan had been married for 7 months. She was pregnant, and on the evening she told him he had stood in their kitchen for a full minute before picking up the test. And then he had looked at her, and she had started laughing, and that was the last uncomplicated night he could remember. The Grayfield contract was the largest the company had undertaken in 4 years. Somewhere in the late planning stages, a cost reduction decision had been made, a substitution of the primary bearing connectors in the upper floors with a lighter grade equivalent that technically met a certain threshold but, when Adrian ran his own analysis, created a risk margin he was not comfortable with under the building's intended load conditions. He flagged it in writing. Twice. The third time, he went up the chain. The meeting that followed included Walter Hayes. Adrian presented his analysis. The numbers were not ambiguous. Walter listened, asked 2 questions, and then said, with the patience of a man who had been deciding things for a long time, the project was on a schedule that could not accommodate a review of decisions already made at the senior level. What was needed was for Adrian to countersign the materials verification form that afternoon. Adrian said he could not sign it. The room went quiet the way rooms do when someone has said the thing that everyone understood could not be unsaid. The phone call came while he was still sitting there. It was Megan. Her voice was constrained in the way he recognized as keeping herself steady. She was at Street Ambrose. They needed him. The OB had found something on the scan and wanted to address it now. And she needed him. He asked to be excused. He was told the meeting was not concluded, that the materials form still needed to be resolved, that his presence was required. Adrian put his pen on the table, looked at the project lead, and said, "My wife is in the hospital. I'm leaving now." He was terminated 4 days later for breach of professional conduct. No severance, no continuation of benefits past the end of the month. The complication Megan had been hospitalized for was manageable under normal conditions. What Adrian now faced, no income, no benefits, a wife who needed sustained prenatal monitoring, were not normal conditions. The pregnancy did not survive. Megan did not recover cleanly from the loss, or from the financial pressure, or from the particular grief of both happening at once. She held on for 7 more months. He was at her side every day he could manage, and at work every hour she was stable enough for him not to be. She died in April, on a Tuesday, with the jasmine candles on the windowsill, because he had bought them and she had asked him to. 2 years later, his cousin Daniel and Daniel's wife were killed in a highway accident outside Portland. Their daughter was 2 years old. Her name was Sophie. There were no other relatives positioned to take her. Adrian had filed the paperwork himself and driven to Portland alone to bring her home. He had put her in the small bedroom he painted pale yellow, and on her first morning he had made her scrambled eggs and said, "Good morning. I'm your dad now. I know that's a lot. We'll figure it out." They had figured it out. He stood at the edge of her door some nights and watched her sleep, and in those moments he understood the word enough in a way he had not before. She was enough. She was the reason the floor was still there when he woke up. What he had never spoken aloud was that the name Walter Hayes occupied a specific, locked-off corridor in his memory. He did not hate the man with fire. He was too tired for fire, but he knew, with the cold certainty of an engineer, that a decision made in that conference room had transferred the weight of a company's schedule onto the bones of his family. He had calculated that weight many times. The answer was always the same. The first time Eleanor met Sophie was an accident. She stopped by Harrington Tower on a Wednesday to drop off revised site drawings, and found Adrian at the reception desk, with a small girl in a plaid school dress, who regarded Eleanor with the frank appraisal particular to 7-year-olds. Eleanor crouched to the girl's level immediately the way people do when they mean it and said hello. Sophie said hello back, then asked whether Eleanor was the lady who worked in the tall glass building that her dad talked about on the phone sometimes. Adrian had said, very quietly, "Sophie?" Sophie had seemed to understand, and returned to her book. But Eleanor had caught the half-second before Adrian's expression rearranged itself. And she had caught what it meant. After that, things move the way they move when neither person is willing to name what is happening but both are making room for it. Eleanor started arriving at site walkthroughs that didn't strictly require her presence. She learned that Sophie was in 2nd grade, and had recently decided she wanted to be a marine biologist, which Adrian was taking seriously, and had taken her to the Natural History Museum twice for. She brought soup to the building one afternoon when the school had called Adrian to collect Sophie for a fever. She sat with Sophie on the lobby couch, reading aloud from a library book about deep-sea creatures in different voices for the anglerfish and the giant squid. Sophie fell asleep against her shoulder. One evening at a small Italian place, Sophie ate most of her pasta, and then asked, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to wrap questions in politeness, "Do you like my dad?" Eleanor glanced at Adrian. He looked at his water glass. "I think your dad is one of the best people I've met," Eleanor said. Sophie found this satisfactory and returned to her pasta. That night, walking home, Eleanor thought about her father. Walter had asked about Adrian twice, methodically, the way Walter asked about things he was filing for later use. She had read it as approval. She told herself it was a good sign. She told herself that her father, however difficult, would recognize what was real when he saw it. And so she had walked back into that lobby the following evening with her gathered courage, and told Adrian her father wanted to meet him. And Adrian had told her that the day he met Walter Hayes, her father had destroyed his family. She asked him to say it again, which was not because she had misheard. It was because she needed the room to exist twice before she could process it. Adrian said it again, in the same tone, not heated, not soft, flat and factual, as a load-bearing specification. "I know your father," he said. "I worked for his company. I know exactly who he is, and what kind of decisions he makes, and what he's willing to sacrifice to make them, and I need you to understand that I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because when you asked me about meeting him, I couldn't stand there and pretend I had nothing in my chest about it." Eleanor asked the question she already feared the answer to. Why had he never told her? "Because I didn't go near you because of that," he said. "I stayed back from you for the same reason. I tried to keep this professional from the beginning." She stood there absorbing this. He was telling her that he had known, all along, who she was, that he had kept careful distance, not out of disinterest but out of something that looked, when she turned it over, like a kind of protection of himself, of Sophie, possibly of her. That was the thing that broke through her defenses more than any of the rest of it. He had saved her project. He had been nothing but correct toward her, and the entire time, he had been carrying this, alone, without using it. She went home and sat down at her kitchen table, and spent 40 minutes on the phone with her father's former executive assistant, a woman named Ruth, who had been with Hayes Urban Group for 15 years, and who retired 3 years ago. Ruth remembered the Grayfield project. She remembered the meeting. She remembered the name Adrian Brooks. She had the careful, slightly distant tone of someone who had thought about this more than once over the years, and was not entirely comfortable with where those thoughts had landed. After that call, Eleanor opened the company's archived HR database, which she had access to as a senior director. It took her an hour and 2 phone calls to piece together what she needed, but it pieced together. She sat at her kitchen table until 2 in the morning, surrounded by printed files and a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink. What she felt was not simple. It was layered in the specific, heavy way of things that involve both love and culpability. She was ashamed of her family's institution in the way that is different from being ashamed of yourself, more complicated, more resistant to resolution. She was frightened by how much she wanted to see Adrian and how poorly timed that wanting was. She was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. But under all of it was a decision that came to her without drama. She was not going to look away from this. She found her father in his study the next morning. Walter Hayes, at 62, was a man who looked exactly like what he was, someone who had made many large decisions and stood by most of them and regretted a smaller number than he might have expected. He was tall and angular. With reading glasses, he pushed up his forehead when he wanted to signal that a conversation had his full attention. He had them on his forehead now. Eleanor put the files on the desk in front of him and asked whether he remembered a structural engineer named Adrian Brooks who had worked at Hayes Urban Group a decade ago. Walter looked at the files. He said he had overseen hundreds of personnel decisions during that period and could not be expected to recall every name. Eleanor described the Grayfield project, the materials dispute, the meeting. She described Adrian being told to countersign documentation he had formally objected to. She described him leaving for the hospital. She described the termination that followed, and the loss of benefits, and what had happened to his wife. Walter was quiet for a long time. He said, eventually, that the company had been in a critical period, that the decision had been reviewed at multiple levels, that he did not remember the specific circumstances she was describing, but that the protocol they had followed was standard for the situation. Standard, Eleanor repeated. He said that every termination carried consequences he could not fully anticipate, and that he had made decisions under conditions that were not always clean, and that this was true of leadership in general. His wife died, Eleanor said. Their baby didn't survive. He lost everything he had built in about 4 months, and the thing that started it was you telling him that the project schedule mattered more than his being at the hospital. Walter removed his glasses from his forehead and set them on the desk. Eleanor kept going. She said the thing that was keeping her awake was not the decision itself. She understood that he had not been thinking about what came after, that he had been focused only on what was directly in front of him. What kept her awake was that a man had been ground up by something her father set in motion. And her father had simply moved on. And it had never registered. 10 years of quarterly reports and ribbon cuttings and the company growing exactly the way it was supposed to grow, and somewhere in the city a man was working maintenance shifts and raising a daughter alone and carrying a photograph of his dead wife, and none of that had been a data point on any spreadsheet Walter looked at. Walter said, "You love this man." It was not a question. He said it in the voice of someone arriving at a fact through analysis rather than feeling. Eleanor didn't answer right away. Her eyes filled. She did not turn away from him. Walter looked at his daughter, really looked at her, in the way parents sometimes stop doing when their children become adults, and saw something in her face he had not seen before, not the composed, precise executive presence she had developed, something older and more essential than that. She was standing on the opposite side of something from him, and she was not moving. He picked up his glasses and put them back on. He said nothing more. Eleanor left the study and did not look back. Sophie sensed it the way she sensed most things, through the texture of the air, rather than anything she could have named. Her father had been quieter for 3 days. He had made her dinner and helped her with her reading, and done everything he normally did, but there was a stillness to him that she recognized from the times when the thing he was thinking about was too large to talk around naturally. She waited until Wednesday evening, when he was sitting on the couch going through the mail. She climbed up beside him and folded her legs under her and said, without preamble, "Is Eleanor not coming back?" Adrian set down the mail. She told him that Eleanor made her feel like the apartment had another person in it who was waiting for them both. Like when they came home, there would be a light on inside that wasn't there before. She had not had that feeling since she was very small, she said. And she could not exactly remember it. But she thought it was something like that. Adrian put his arm around her, and she leaned against his side. He sat there for a while with the mail on his lap and his daughter against his ribs, and something in his chest that was doing its best to stay arranged. That night, after Sophie was asleep, he called Marcus, who had been his closest friend since college, and who had the useful quality of listening without performing. He told him about Eleanor. He told him about Walter. He told him all of it in sequence, which he had not done aloud before. When he finished, Marcus said, "What are you afraid of?" Adrian thought about it for a longer time than the question should have required. "I'm afraid Sophie gets attached to a world that doesn't actually have room for her in it," he said. "I'm afraid I let her love someone and then it falls apart. And she absorbs that the way she absorbs everything quietly, so I don't worry. I'm afraid of being the reason she learns that lesson early." Marcus said, "You know that fear is never going to go away by waiting for conditions to change." Adrian said he knew. She already loves her, Marcus said. Sophie already loves Eleanor. You heard it tonight. Adrian said he had heard it. He sat at the kitchen table after the call, with a glass of water, and the city outside and the quiet of the apartment around him. And he thought about the photograph in his wallet. He thought about the day it had been taken, and the man he had been then, the one who had not yet understood what it cost to love something. He had paid that cost in full, with interest. He had been paying it for a decade. The question was whether the cost of not trying was something he was prepared to pay just as long. It was a Tuesday morning when Walter Hayes came to Harrington Tower. He did not call ahead. He did not come through the main lobby. He came in through the parking structure entrance and asked the first person he saw where the maintenance office was. Adrian was in the technical room behind the east stairwell, reviewing the HVAC schedule for the spring switchover, when the door opened. He looked up and recognized Walter immediately. The way you recognize someone you have thought about with specificity for a long time with no surprise, only a settling, as if the moment had been waiting for a scheduled appointment. Walter stood in the doorway. He was wearing a coat that cost more than Adrian's monthly rent. He looked, for the first time in Adrian's experience of him, like he was not certain what he was going to say. I wanted to hear it from you, Walter said. Directly. Adrian set down his clipboard. He did not offer him a seat. He did not reach for any particular formality. He said, "All right," and then he told it simply. The way you tell a thing you have told yourself many times, not with heat, because the heat had cooled into something denser long ago. He described the Grayfield meeting, the materials form, the phone call from Megan, the man at the door of the conference room saying that the meeting was not concluded. He described the termination, the benefits cut off, the weeks that followed. He did not embellish. He did not pause for effect. He gave it to Walter the way a structural engineer gives findings. Clean, documented, without editorial commentary. Walter stood and listened without interrupting. His face moved through several expressions that were not quite emotions and not quite their absence. Something in between. The thing that I've never been able to put down, Adrian said, near the end, isn't the job. It isn't even the benefits, or the money, or any of the specific things. It's that on the day I most needed to be somewhere, I was told that the project's needs outweighed mine. By a person who was never going to be in a position where his needs were outweighed by anything, that asymmetry is what broke something in me. Not rage, just a very clear, lasting knowledge of how much I was worth to that company. Walter looked at the photograph pinned to the corkboard above Adrian's desk. It was a snapshot of Sophie at the beach, squinting into the sun, holding a shell. Your daughter? He asked. My daughter, Adrian said. He told Walter about Sophie not as a bid for sympathy, but because it was relevant. Any conversation about his life now was a conversation about her life. Sophie would walk into any relationship he entered, and he had spent years making sure she walked only into rooms that would not teach her she was worth less than she was. Walter said, If I apologize to you, what would that mean? Adrian looked at him for a moment. An apology doesn't revise the filing date on a death certificate, he said. It doesn't change what Megan went through, or what Sophie goes through every time someone asks about her mother and she has to decide how much to say. An apology is what you offer when you've run out of other options. Walter was quiet. He looked at the floor. Then back at Adrian. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I came here because I needed to stand in the room where you actually live and work and understand the real distance between us, not what I imagined it was from behind a desk. I understand now that a man who loses what you lost because of a schedule has been wronged in a way that I have no right to define for him. He picked up his coat and left through the same door he had entered. The room was very quiet. Adrian stood at his desk and looked at the photograph of Sophie squinting at the sun, holding her shell, and thought about the particular weight of a man who had stood somewhere he was not powerful and stayed anyway. Eleanor did not wait to hear from Adrian. She had made herself a promise on the drive home from her father's house that she would not manage the situation by waiting for him to lead her through it. That was not who she was, and it was not, she suspected, the kind of woman he needed her to be. She went to the company's legal team and asked them to conduct a full audit of personnel terminations from the Grayfield project period. She sat in those meetings herself and made clear that what she was looking for were cases where individuals had been let go under conditions that did not meet the company's own stated standards, particularly cases involving loss of benefits at critical personal moments. There were 4 such cases. Hers was the most significant. She proposed a reparations structure to the board. She did not call it that in the presentation, because language was strategic, but that was what it was. A fund for retroactive support to affected former employees and their families, paired with a formal acknowledgement in the company's institutional record that the practices of that period had not met acceptable standards. The board pushed back. She held the line. 3 sessions later, it passed. She was not under any illusion that this undid anything. You cannot retroactively fund a pregnancy that did not survive, or reverse the grief of a woman who died in April with jasmine candles on the windowsill. You cannot return 10 years. She did not pretend to believe that writing checks and updating institutional records was the same thing as justice, but it was the difference between an organization that acknowledged what it had done and one that simply waited for the people it had harmed to die, or move away or stop talking about it. When it was done, she drove to Harrington Tower on a Friday afternoon and asked for Adrian through the front desk. He came down in his work clothes, a little wary, a little guarded in the way he had been guarded with her from the beginning, but there, in the lobby, looking at her directly, she told him what she had done. She did not present it as something that would change anything between them. She said she had done it because it was overdue, because it was wrong, and because she could not go on building things on a foundation that included that particular kind of unacknowledged damage without it meaning something about her. He listened without speaking. "I'm not asking you to feel differently about my father," she said. "I'm not asking you to feel differently about any of it. I know I can't give you back what was taken. I know the shape of what you lost." She said the thing she had been turning over for days, the thing that felt truest when she stripped away everything strategic and diplomatic, that if the day ever came when he found he could not love her, she would still spend the rest of her career trying to make sure his daughter grew up in a world that was built a little more honestly than the one that had been built on his back. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically. Not the way things change in films, with the swell of music and the light at just the right angle. It was quieter than that. It was the change that happens when a wall discovers it does not need to be weight-bearing anymore. A small, cellular shift, internal, nearly invisible unless you had been watching very carefully. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I know you mean that." "I do," she said. He looked at her for a long time, and then, for the first time, she watched him not look away. 3 weeks passed. The days between them had a different quality, now not resolved, exactly, but breathable. The distance had not entirely closed, but it was no longer a wall. It was a space that both of them moved through carefully, with a kind of mutual respect for what was still fragile. Sophie, for her part, had been told that Eleanor was someone her dad trusted, and that they were still figuring out how to be friends, and that sometimes being friends was something that took time to become. Sophie had accepted this with the philosophical equanimity of a child who has learned to understand that adults often take longer to do things than they strictly need to. Walter, in the weeks since his visit to Harrington Tower, had been quieter than his daughter could remember him being. He had stopped coming to the office at the hours that telegraphed power, and had started coming at the hours that suggested actual work. He had eaten dinner with Eleanor twice, and both times he had asked her questions about her projects rather than about the company's return on investment in them. It was a small difference. It was not nothing. He had also, in his own time and without telling Eleanor until it was already done, sold a portion of his personal equity stake in a subsidiary, and used the proceeds to establish a healthcare access fund for the families of construction and maintenance workers employed by Hayes Urban Group's active properties. He had named it the Megan Brooks Foundation. Eleanor had heard about it from the company's finance director, who had processed the paperwork and could not entirely contain his bewilderment. She had called her father. He had said, evenly, that it seemed appropriate. He had sent the full documentation package to Adrian directly, with a cover letter that was 1 paragraph long and said only that he understood an apology was insufficient and that he was not offering one in its place. He was offering what he had. He was asking for nothing in return. On a Saturday afternoon in late September, Eleanor took Sophie to the park on the east side of the city, where the open field was wide enough for kite flying, and the hot dog cart near the south entrance had been there since before either of them was born. The kite was yellow and shaped like a fish. Sophie had picked it out. It was terrible aerodynamically, and Eleanor had repaired the tail twice in the parking lot before they got it airborne. They had been there about an hour when Adrian arrived. He had come from a half-day shift, still in his jacket, hands in his pockets, walking across the field toward them in the particular way he walked, unhurried but very deliberate, like someone who has thought through exactly where they are going. Sophie spotted him first and ran. He caught her, swung her once, set her down, and took the kite string she thrust into his hands with the focused authority of a child, delegating critical responsibilities. Eleanor watched him from a few yards away. The afternoon light was at that low golden angle. He was laughing at something Sophie had said. She could not hear the words over the wind. He walked toward her after a few minutes, Sophie having retaken full operational control of the kite. He stood beside Eleanor and looked out at the field. "She told me Walter sent a handwritten letter," he said. "A few days ago." "I heard that too," Eleanor said. "I read it." He was quiet for a moment. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said he wanted to do something right, if I would allow it. That's the word he used. Allow. Eleanor said nothing. She let the silence do what silence could do. "The foundation," Adrian said. He put her name on it. He did not need to say anything else for Eleanor to understand what that meant. Megan Brooks, 10 years gone, named on something that would keep existing. Not a tribute. Not a monument. A mechanism, something that moved in the world. He stood there for a long time. Sophie called out something from across the field, and he raised a hand in acknowledgement. "I don't know if I can forgive him completely," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I don't think forgiveness is something I can will into existence, because it would make things simpler. It has to be something that arrives when the conditions for it are real." "I know," Eleanor said, "but I don't want to spend the rest of my life looking back at the place I fell," he said. "I've been standing at that edge for 10 years. I know every stone in it. And I think," he paused. He looked at her. "I think the place I am right now is better than where I was, and I'd like to keep moving toward better." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a long time. He reached over and took her hand. It was not dramatic. He simply placed his hand around hers, there in the open field, with the yellow fish kite pulling against the wind, and Sophie's voice bright in the afternoon, and held it. From across the field, Sophie looked over and saw. She turned back to the kite immediately, with the elaborate nonchalance of someone working very hard not to show that they had been waiting for exactly this. But the smile got away from her. It always did with Sophie. They stood like that in the low golden light, the three of them in the wide field, the city rising gently at the edges of the park, the kite tipping and recovering in the autumn wind. Across the path, near the row of old oaks at the park's northern edge, a tall man in a dark coat stood alone, hands in his pockets. He did not come closer. He did not call out. He simply stood and looked at them, the way a person looks at something they have no standing to claim but cannot bring themselves to stop watching. Adrian saw him. He looked at Walter for a long, measured moment, reading him the way he read a sight, the way he read a structure, looking for the load-bearing truth of it. Then he gave one small, deliberate nod. Not absolution, not an invitation, a recognition that the man across the grass had come, had stood where he was not powerful, had done the one thing he could still do. That it was not nothing, that from here, there might be somewhere to go. Walter nodded back. Then he turned and walked away through the trees. Sophie called out for the third time that the kite needed emergency rescue. And Adrian let go of Eleanor's hand only long enough to jog across to his daughter, laughing at something she was shouting about the physics of the situation, his voice carrying easily across the field in the warm September air. There are apologies that cannot reach the places that matter most. They cannot find their way through the years between the moment of harm and the moment of speaking. They cannot restore what was taken, or undo what was lost, or make the dead less dead. A letter with a woman's name on a foundation letterhead does not bring her back. A nod across a park does not erase a decade. These are things that remain true, and remaining true is what they do. But there are also people who have been carrying something heavy for so long that they have forgotten what it felt like to set it down. And there are moments, not redemptions, not fairy tales, but honest, imperfect, forward-moving moments when the carrying stops, when the weight is still there, in memory, in the photograph in a wallet, in the name spoken softly at a foundation meeting, but it no longer defines the whole of the road ahead. That afternoon, in the park, with a yellow fish kite, and a child's laughter, and a woman whose hand had been taken without ceremony but with complete intention. Adrian Brooks understood that he was still standing, that the floor was still there, that the future, which he had not trusted for a very long time, had not given up on requiring his attention. He reached for Eleanor's hand again when he came back. She gave it to him. Sophie ran ahead, and the afternoon kept going, the way afternoons do when the people in them have decided, quietly and without announcement, to stay.